Harald Fairhair stood amidst the charred wreckage of his rival's longships at Hafrsfjord, a matted, unwashed mess of a man who refused to comb his hair until an entire nation knelt at his feet. This wasn't just a madman's vow, it was the violent foundation of the Scandinavia we know today. We've been sold a Hollywood myth of lawless raiders, but the real story is a cold-blooded Game of Thrones where the prize wasn't just gold, but the absolute sovereignty of Northern Europe. How did fragmented, warring tribes transform into the powerful Christian monarchies of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden in just 3 generations? From Harald Bluetooth's high-stakes religious gamble to Cnut the Great's forgotten North Sea Empire, the path from Viking chaos to royal stability was paved with a specific type of betrayal that the Sagas have spent centuries trying to hide. To understand how the Viking Age actually ended, you have to see the one thing these kings were willing to sacrifice to keep their crowns. We remember the Vikings for the fire and steel of their raids, but their greatest legacy isn't what they destroyed, it's what they built. Beneath the chaos of the 9th century, a brutal power struggle was forging the map of Northern Europe. From Harald Fairhair's impossible vow to the sprawling North Sea Empire of Cnut the Great, this is the story of how warring tribes became the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Forget the sagas. This is the blood-soaked reality of how the Viking Age ended and Scandinavia was born. To understand the birth of Scandinavia, you have to stop thinking about countries and start thinking about clans. In the mid-800s, Norway, or Denmark, didn't exist as borders on a map. They were a chaotic jigsaw puzzle of nearly 30 petty kingdoms. Each was ruled by a local jarl, or a konungur, who answered to no one but his own sword. This was a world of thing assemblies and localized blood feuds, where power was as fluid as the tides in the fjords. If you were a farmer in Rogaland or a trader in Jutland, your loyalty wasn't to a crown, it was to the local strongman who promised you wouldn't be sold into the Dublin slave markets by the neighbor in the next valley. This extreme fragmentation was the Vikings' greatest strength during a raid, making them unpredictable and impossible to pin down. But it was their fatal flaw in a rapidly evolving Europe. While the Carolingian Empire to the south was consolidating power through administrative bureaucracy, and the unified front of the church, the north remained a meat grinder of ego. Every petty king harbored the ambition to be the High King, but none were willing to endure the perceived shame of submission. The Sagas paint this era as one of grand adventure and heroic duels, but the reality was a grinding cycle of scorched earth tactics and generational vendettas that kept the region in a state of permanent instability. We've been conditioned to believe that legendary figures like Harald Fairhair fought for the glory of the North, or a sense of national identity. We imagine them standing on the prows of their longships, looking toward a unified future with a sense of destiny. But here is the cold, hard truth that the sagas often gloss over. The unification of Scandinavia wasn't an act of visionary leadership or national pride. It was a brutal, corporate-style hostile takeover. Harald and his successors weren't trying to save the Viking way of life. They were the ones who systematically dismantled it from the inside out, replacing ancient freedoms with a crushing new reality of taxes and tithes. The 9th century North was a pressure cooker. For centuries, the Scandinavian survival strategy was simple. When resources got tight, you got on a boat and took them from someone else. But by the time Harald Fairhair and his contemporaries emerged, the world was changing. To the south, the Carolingian Empire wasn't just a target anymore, it was a mirror. The Norse elite saw the absolute power of European monarchs and realized that freedom was a liability. In the old system, if you were a king, you were only a king as long as you were winning. The moment the loot stopped flowing, or a harvest failed, your own people would sacrifice you to Odin without blinking. This instability created a brutal paradox. To survive the rising tide of organized European states, the Vikings had to become one. But to become a state, they had to destroy the very thing that made them Vikings, their radical independence. This wasn't a peaceful transition. It was a systematic erasure of an ancient way of life. We're talking about a world where taxation was seen as a form of slavery, and centralized law was an insult to a man's honor. Every fortress built by these new kings was a middle finger to the old gods and the old ways. But here's where the story takes a sharp, jagged turn. We've been told that these kings were the ultimate Vikings, the strongest, the fastest, the most ruthless. We imagine them as the peak of Norse culture, but the reality is far more uncomfortable. These legendary unifiers weren't the heroes of the Viking Age, they were its executioners. The very men we celebrate as the greatest Vikings were actually the ones who worked the hardest to make sure Viking became a dead word. Take Harald Fairhair. The Sagas claim he united Norway just to win the hand of a beautiful princess. That's the romantic spin. The ruthless reality? After crushing his rivals at Hafrsfjord, he did the unthinkable. He claimed outright ownership of the very dirt under his subjects' feet. For the first time ever, historically free Norse farmers were forced to pay rent on their own ancestral land. He basically invented the Viking property tax. But you don't start taxing heavily armed, hyper-independent warriors without facing massive blowback. To keep those swords away from his throat, the kings that followed needed a completely new kind of authority. One that didn't just rely on having the biggest army, they needed a cheat code. Over in Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth found exactly that. Christianity. The history books politely state that Bluetooth converted the Danes. What he actually did was weaponize a foreign religion. By aligning himself with the massive infrastructure of the Catholic Church, Bluetooth transformed from a disposable tribal warlord into a monarch appointed by God himself. Suddenly, rebelling against the king wasn't just risky treason, it was a literal ticket to hell. It was the ultimate political shield. But trading Odin for Jesus crossed a permanent red line, and it triggered a retaliation that not even his own blood could forgive. Bluetooth's religious power grab ignited a brutal civil war, led by his own son, Swine Forkbeard. Swine rallied the angry, disenfranchised pagan traditionalists, drove his father into exile, and snatched the crown. It looked like a massive victory for the old Viking ways. The pagans had won, but Sweyn pulled a legendary bait-and-switch. Once he sat on the throne, he didn't dismantle his father's centralized state. He supercharged it. He took those wild, independent Viking raiders and forged them into a disciplined, state-funded military machine. And once he had total control of that machine, he pointed it straight at a target that would completely rewrite European history. That target was England. Swine didn't just want to burn coastal monasteries and sail home with a boatload of silver. He wanted the entire island. Sweyn executed a flawless invasion and became the first Viking king of England, proving the Norse war machine could swallow an established Christian nation whole. But conquering an island is the easy part. Keeping it is where the real blood is spilled. Swine died just weeks after taking the throne, leaving a violently unstable realm to his son, Cnut the Great. And Cnut didn't just hold the line. He built a medieval superpower. He fused Denmark, Norway, and England into the legendary North Sea Empire. How did he pull off a geopolitical miracle? By operating like a ruthless mob boss. On day one, Cnut executed every English noble he suspected of disloyalty and handed their lands to his own Scandinavian enforcers. He forged a tri-nation monopoly on trade, wealth, and military might that locked down northern Europe. But ruling an empire that spans a hostile, freezing ocean requires a terrifying level of micromanagement. And Cnut was overplaying his hand. Over in the east, Sweden watched this massive power grab and flat out refused to bend the knee. Kings like Eric the Victorious had already forged a hardened, fiercely independent Swedish state. When Cnut tried to force them into his empire at the massive naval battle of the Helge, he technically won the water, but lost the war of attrition. Sweden bled Cnut's resources dry. The North Sea Empire was held together by absolutely nothing but Cnut's terrifying reputation. The moment his heart stopped beating in 1035, the entire mega-state detonated. Overnight, the crowns of 3 nations were up for grabs. This chaotic power vacuum spawned the final apocalyptic chapter of the Viking Age. The year was 1066. History classes teach us this was the year the Normans conquered England. What they leave out is that the Normans only won because someone else broke the English shield wall first. Enter Harald Hardrada. Hardrada was the exiled king of Norway, a giant, battle-scarred mercenary who had literally hacked his way out of the Byzantine emperor's elite Varangian guard. He was the apex predator of the old Viking world. Hardrada launched a massive do-or-die invasion of England, convinced that brute force and ancestral terror would win him Cnut's lost empire. He thought he was launching a glorious revival of the Viking Golden Age, but Hardrada was completely blind to the new reality. He wasn't sailing toward a crown. He was sailing straight into a trap that would permanently bury the Viking Age in the mud of Stamford Bridge. September 1066. Hardrada's army was lounging in the sun, their heavy chainmail left back at the ships. They expected a terrified English surrender. Instead, they got an English army that had just sprinted 200 miles in 4 days. King Harold Godwinson hit the Viking line like a freight train. Hardrada fought like an absolute demon, but a Saxon arrow tore through his throat. He choked on his own blood, and the Viking Age died with him. Out of 300 longships that sailed to England, only 24 limped home. It was total annihilation. But here's the bizarre twist. The destruction of Hardrada's army was the absolute best thing that could have happened to the new kings of Scandinavia. Why? Because the loudest, most violent traditionalists were just wiped out in a single afternoon. The Viking Old Guard was dead in the English dirt. Back in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, the surviving monarchs didn't mourn. They capitalized. The pressure cooker was finally depressurized, giving them the breathing room to build legitimate, European-style states. But there was still one massive threat standing in their way: the Jarls. These local warlords still held the wealth, the prime land, and the fierce loyalty of the commoners. If the kings wanted absolute sovereignty, outliving the Viking raiders wasn't enough. They had to systematically exterminate their own aristocracy. What followed wasn't a glorious war fought on open battlefields. It was a shadowy, cutthroat campaign of political assassinations, rigged courts, and forced exiles. The kings stopped wielding axes and started weaponizing the law. If a powerful jarl stepped out of line, he wasn't challenged to an honorable duel. He was declared a heretic. His ancestral lands were aggressively seized by the crown, and his silver was funneled straight into the church. The Norse elite traded the unpredictable chaos of the raid for the crushing, inescapable efficiency of the tax collector. They paved over wooden longhouses to build massive stone cathedrals. But while Norway and Denmark submitted to this new corporate-style monarchy, Sweden refused to go quietly. Deep in the Swedish forests, the old gods were making their final bloody stand. While Danish and Norwegian kings built stone cathedrals, the Swedes were still hanging sacrifices from the trees at the great temple of Uppsala. They looked at the creeping spread of centralized taxation and drew a hard line in the snow. When King Inge the Elder tried to ban pagan rituals in the 1080s, the Swedes didn't just protest. They pelted him with rocks and chased him out of the kingdom. They replaced him with Blodsven, literally swine the sacrificer. He instantly rebooted the massive pagan festivals. It was the ultimate middle finger to the new European order. The old Viking way was back in business, but the celebration was a death trap. 3 years later, Inge returned. He didn't bring priests, he brought fire. Under the cover of darkness, Inge surrounded Blodsven's longhouse and burned him alive. He didn't just kill a rival, he incinerated the last organized political resistance of the pagan north. The great temple of Uppsala was completely dismantled, and a church was built directly over its ashes. The message was undeniable. Odin was dead, and the crown owned his grave. Sweden was dragged, kicking and screaming, into the medieval European club. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were finally locked in. The borders were drawn, the kings were absolute. But this absolute power cost the Norsemen their identity. To become legitimate European monarchs, these kings couldn't just defeat the Vikings. They had to erase them. Legendary raiders were suddenly hunted as outlaws. Fiercely independent farmers were reduced to heavily taxed peasants. The men who built Scandinavia didn't save the Viking Age. They suffocated it. Yet the new monarchs faced one final, terrifying problem. You can burn the temples, but you can't instantly breed the violence out of a warrior culture. Thousands of highly trained, hyper-aggressive Norsemen were suddenly unemployed. A bored Viking is a dangerous Viking. The kings desperately needed to point these killers at a new target before they rebelled and burned the newly formed kingdoms to the ground. Their solution: they didn't stop the raiding. They just gave it a holy rebranding. The solution was as brilliant as it was blood-soaked: the Northern Crusades. The kings took that ancestral Viking hunger for gold and glory and redirected it toward the Baltic and the East, but this time they did it with the Pope's blessing. They weren't raiders anymore, they were soldiers of Christ. The same longships that once terrified Europe were now the primary tools of European expansion. This was the final stage of the transition, the moment the Viking spirit was officially domesticated and put to work for the state. This is the cold reality the sagas try to mask with poetry. Scandinavia wasn't built by the strength of the Viking spirit, but by its systematic execution. To create Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, the kings had to kill the Viking to save the Norsemen. They traded the wild, radical equality of the fjord for the rigid, divine hierarchy of the throne. They traded the freedom of the sea for the security of the border. When we look at Harald Fairhair's matted hair, Bluetooth's cross, or Hardrada's final breath at Stamford Bridge, we aren't seeing the height of Viking power. We're seeing a funeral. The Viking Age didn't end because the Norsemen were defeated by outside enemies. It ended because their own leaders realized that a king cannot rule a nation of wolves. To wear a crown, they had to build a cage, but in that sacrifice, they achieved something the old gods never could. By murdering their own culture, these kings ensured their people's survival. They transformed a collection of scattered, doomed tribes into the most stable, prosperous, and enduring nations on earth. The longships are gone, and the altars to Odin have long since crumbled. But the map of the modern world is still written in the blood of the men who were willing to betray their heritage to build a future. The Viking didn't just disappear into the mist of history, he evolved. He stopped burning the world and started owning it. When Harald Fairhair finally laid down his comb and looked in the mirror, he didn't see the last of the legendary raiders. He saw the first of the European statesmen. The matted hair was gone, and with it, the era of the wild, unchained North. We look back at the Viking Age as a time of glorious fire, but the true brilliance of this story is found in the cold, calculated silence that followed. The kings of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden didn't just win a war, they solved a survival equation. They looked at a world that was rapidly centralizing, a world where scattered tribes were destined for the meat grinder of history, and they made a choice. They chose the crown over the axe. They chose the stone cathedral over the wooden longhouse. They chose to betray the gods of their fathers to ensure the survival of their sons. This is the satisfying, brutal truth. The Viking had to die so that Scandinavia could live. The betrayal we see in the sagas, the taxes, the forced religion, the crushed rebellions, wasn't a failure of leadership. It was the ultimate sacrifice. By building a cage for the wolves, these monarchs didn't just end an age of raiding. They laid the foundation for the most stable, peaceful, and prosperous societies in human history. Today, the fjords are quiet, and the longships are buried in the mud. But the legacy of the Viking isn't found in a museum or a myth. It's found in the very existence of three sovereign nations that refused to disappear. The Viking didn't lose. He traded his fury for a future, transforming from the destroyer of the old world into the architect of the new. The age of the Viking is over, but the era of the North has never truly ended. The Viking Age didn't end because the Norsemen lost their edge. It ended because they outgrew their own myth. We celebrate the raider, the longship, and the wild, unchained freedom of the North. But the true brilliance of this story lies in the calculated sacrifice of that identity. These kings looked into the eyes of a changing world and realized that a nation of wolves cannot survive in an era of shepherds. They traded the axe for the law, the saga for the ledger, and the old gods for a seat at the table of history. It is a brutal, awe-inspiring lesson in evolution. Sometimes you have to burn the world you love to build the world you need. The peace and prosperity of modern Scandinavia isn't an accident. It's the interest paid on 1,000 years of blood, a testament to the men who were brave enough to kill the Vikings so the North could finally live. The peace of modern Scandinavia isn't a coincidence. It is the interest paid on 1,000 years of calculated betrayal. But while the kings were busy caging the wolves of the North to build their cathedrals, they created a new, even more disciplined predator, one that would soon unleash its fury under the banner of a different god. To see how these soldiers of Christ took the Viking war machine and turned it into a holy crusade that redefined the East, click the video on your screen right now. And if you believe that history is written by the victors but belongs to those who look deeper, subscribe and join us as we unearth the brutal evolution of the world's greatest empires. The longships are buried, but the real story is only beginning.